Picture this. You are a 12-year-old boy named Marcus, standing in a marble hall beneath the Palatine Hill in the year 67 AD. The gold chains around your ankles clink as you shiver, not from cold, but from terror. Emperor Nero himself stands before you, inspecting your bare back like your cattle. He whispers about your price to the slave dealer, as his fingers trace your scars like they're ink on parchment. Tonight, you will learn what it means to be a spintria, a child whose body becomes a coin in the most twisted sexual economy the ancient world ever created. And this moment, this humiliation, is not the end. It's just the beginning. In the Roman Empire, sex wasn't private. It was performance. It was punishment. It was power. The steam rises like ghosts in the morning. You walk barefoot on marble tiles, past sweating bodies, oil-slicked skin, and the echo of laughter bouncing off the dome ceiling. You're not here to bathe. You're here to watch or be watched. This is the Thermae, the public bathhouse of Rome, part spa, part theater, part sexual marketplace. A senator debates philosophy while a slave massages oil into his thighs. A merchant whispers to a boy who can't be older than 15. Two women recline on warm benches, their fingers lingering too long over each other's shoulders, and no one turns away. Because in Rome, nothing is private. Not your politics, not your pleasure, not your shame. Even emperors stripped here. And their eyes decided your future. Privacy was a Greek invention. The Romans rejected it. They believed that what you did behind closed doors revealed less than what you dared to do in front of others. There were public feasts where naked dancers acted out God's seductions. Weddings that ended in choreographed sex rituals. Religious festivals that blurred into mass orgies under torchlight. The line between sacred and obscene didn't exist. It was the same thing. And if you were a performer or a slave, your body wasn't yours. It was a symbol, a warning, a trophy, a tool. One emperor made guests dress as prostitutes for dinner. Another held a mock wedding with himself as the bride, just to humiliate his enemies. To say, "I own you," without ever saying a word. In Rome, the gaze was power. To look was to own. To be seen was to be measured and judged. And in this empire, everyone was always watching. You could be a goddess in a mosaic by morning, and a performer in a banquet by night. A man could lose honor not for who he slept with, but for how. Submission was punished. Exhibition was currency. And shame? Shame was a private thing. But Rome didn't believe in privacy. Even death was public, and so was desire. So if you lived in this world, there was only one rule that mattered. Cover nothing, unless you're hiding weakness. If you want more forgotten stories, hidden rules, and raw truth behind the world's most powerful empires, subscribe now. Every week, we uncover the parts of history that were never meant to survive. And the people who did, tap the bell. To stay in the story, share this video if it made you look at ancient Rome with new eyes. You're not a person. Not really. You're skin with a story someone else gets to write. And in the Roman Empire, that story was always about power. A general returns from war with gold, spices, and 20 enslaved bodies. He doesn't display the loot. He parades the flesh. Naked men, oiled and chained. Young girls with painted faces. Children from distant lands. To touch them, to control them, to take them, was a public signal. I conquered them. And now I can do anything I want. In this empire, your body meant something. Not to you, but to the people who owned you. And the more helpless you looked, the more status it gave them. Rome's elite didn't hide their desire. They weaponized it. An emperor didn't need to be gentle, or kind, or even aroused. He needed to be seen taking what he wanted from anyone of any gender at any time. Sex wasn't intimate. It was A hierarchy. Only the weak were penetrated. Only the conquered submitted. A Roman citizen could sleep with a male slave and still be considered masculine so long as he was the one giving, not receiving. To be passive was to be shamed. To be used was to be beneath human thought. So sex became performance, ritual, politics. Even marriages were often acts of optics. Virgins chosen for display. Wives paraded in silk. Mistresses kept as trophies. And if your body didn't bring someone status, it was discarded like spoiled wine. Now step into a Roman villa. On the walls, mosaics of gods mid-orgy, women writhing, boys with wings. In the courtyard, marble statues of bound lovers, or soldiers pinning civilians to the earth. Art wasn't separate from life, thought it reflected it. It justified it, thought to be beautiful was to be useful. To be desired was to be owned. Even death couldn't save you. Some emperors ordered favorite concubines embalmed and displayed, or violated, their bodies even after death, because in this world, a powerful man's desire never ended, and a weak person's body never truly belonged to them, not in life, not in legend. So remember, in Rome, what mattered wasn't who you were. It was what your body said about someone else. They said no one escaped Capri the same. It was paradise. Marble courtyards, sparkling cliffs, turquoise waters. But behind its beauty was a prison of whispers, bruises, and bleeding childhood. On this island, Emperor Tiberius built his kingdom of silence. He called it retreat. The empire called it escape. But for the boys taken there, some barely 10, it was a sentence. Chosen for their looks, trained to perform. Painted like girls, beaten like soldiers. Tiberius didn't just want obedience. He wanted ritual. He trained them to swim between his legs like minnows. He forced them to mimic acts from art, from myth, from dreams so depraved they couldn't be named. And all the while, guards stood outside, silent, knowing, because when the emperor watched, no one else looked away. Nero didn't hide in islands. He wanted audiences. His palace was a stage. His dinner parties, performances. And sex? It wasn't hidden in shadows. It was choreographed. He married a boy named Sporus after having him castrated. Draped him in jewels. Called him Empress. Held a wedding ceremony in public. Weeks later, he married a former slave. This time as the bride. Wearing a veil, moaning dramatically while his generals cheered. And if you laughed too little, you disappeared. Nero didn't want pleasure. He wanted submission disguised as celebration. If it humiliated Rome. Even better, because nothing proved your power more than making others smile while you broke them. In Rome, the emperor wasn't just your ruler. He was your mirror. If he desired pain, others followed. If he rewarded cruelty, cruelty became custom. And if he turned a child into a prop, the world clapped to stay alive. There were no safe walls. No hiding places. No secrets. Because the closer you were to power, the more exposed you became. The emperor didn't need to punish you with whips or chains. He just needed to watch you and make sure you knew it. And if he was always watching ... maybe, just maybe, so was everyone else. You are 10 years old. Your name? It doesn't matter anymore. That was left behind at the auction block. Now, you're just a body, shaved, oiled, inspected. You're told you belong to a noble house, that you'll be clothed in silk, fed grapes, kept warm. But what you learn is this: silk can bind. Grapes can gag. Warmth can be a trap. You're assigned to a trainer, not for language or manners or reading, but for silence, for obedience, for how to move in a room when you're being watched. You're not learning how to live. You're learning how to be touched without flinching. In elite Roman circles, the word spintria meant more than a role. It meant a sentence. These were the chosen ones, trained from childhood to serve in private chambers, dressed in pearls and gold, made to smile even when their eyes said otherwise. They had no voice in court. No right to marry, no right to say no, but they had value. Not as people, but as possessions. The more passive they were, the more praise they earned. The more humiliating their task, the more elite the client. Some were even stamped with tokens. Literal coins, passed around like currency. They were bodies with price tags, and refusal? That wasn't the word the empire understood. Because in the Roman world, only free men could consent. And even then, only if they weren't on their knees. There were those who couldn't even pretend to be free. Eunuchs, castrated young to ensure loyalty, were often placed in royal households, temples, or bedrooms. They were kept to serve, to observe, and above all, to obey. But some learned how to weaponize that obedience. With no threat of heirs, they gained the trust of jealous emperors. With no male urges, they were seen as safe near royal women. And slowly, in shadows, some rose as informants, whisperers, puppet masters. Their rebellion wasn't loud. It was calculated. Their power came not from freedom, but from survival. They couldn't say no. So they learned how to shape the yes. No laws protected them. No gods rescued them. And no history books told their stories. But behind the mosaics and marble, behind the legends of Rome's greatness, were rooms filled with names erased and bodies that never got to choose. Her feet never touched the street. She was carried, veiled, perfumed, untouched, through a city that cheered for her like a goddess, not because they knew her, but because she was pure, a Vestal virgin sworn to chastity, silence, and sacred fire, chosen as a child, buried alive if she broke her vow. The Romans believed virginity was holy currency, a bridge to the gods. Untouched girls were offered to temples, kept in marble chambers, wrapped in white, not for their souls, but for what their bodies hadn't done yet. But that holiness came with chains. They were praised not for who they were, but for what they hadn't become. And that made them valuable, but never safe. In palaces, purity took on a different role. Emperors collected virgin girls like exotic birds, symbols of conquest. In some courts, a man's power was measured by how many untouched women he had claimed. It wasn't love. It wasn't even lust. It was ritualized domination. There were ceremonies, baths laced with oils, nights where silence was demanded and blood was celebrated. To take a virgin was seen as cleansing, even divine. And in some corners of Roman religion, sacrifice itself demanded an unspoiled body, not for what it could feel, but for what it could represent: innocence, purity, control. And once it was taken, the girl lost her use. She would be married off, or discarded, or passed along, because in a system obsessed with untouched flesh, the moment you were used, you were worth less. But the myth of the pure virgin was always a lie. It wasn't about chastity. It wasn't about holiness. It was about access. The untouched girl was a symbol, not of innocence, but of possession waiting to happen. Her silence was seen as obedience. Her fear was labeled grace. A lack of experience became someone else's pleasure. And no matter how high her pedestal, she was still trapped. Even the Vestals, Rome's most respected women, were watched, controlled, and punished without mercy. One slip, one rumor, and they were buried alive, walled into the earth beneath the city they once blessed. No one asked what she believed. No one asked what she felt, because in the empire of domination, even purity was weaponized. And when a body was untouched, it only meant someone else hadn't gotten there yet. The room is dark, not with shadow, but with intent. A marble floor slick with oil. Bronze hooks hang like ornaments. Cushions embroidered with scenes no child should see. And in the center, a stage. Not for music, not for drama. For flesh. Rome didn't whisper its desires. It displayed them like trophies. Pain wasn't hidden in locked rooms. It was choreographed, ritualized, performed like theater. Some noblemen hosted feasts where guests were entertained not by music, but by cries. A slave whipped to rhythm. A girl suspended in midair, painted in gold. A boy forced to dance. Each step punished if too slow. They called it art. They called it culture. But it was neither. It was domination, masked with candles and song. For the Roman elite, pain was more than power. It was arousal. They built entire rooms for it. Secret wings in villas. Underground chambers in baths. Even temples had spaces where worship blended with wounds. They mixed silk with shackles. Wine. With blood. In some circles, pleasure was defined by how much pain the other could endure before breaking. There were contests of endurance, of cruelty, of silence. Those who could keep from screaming earned coins. Those who couldn't earned nothing. And spectators watched, not out of horror, but out of hunger. Because to them, suffering was erotic, as long as it wasn't theirs. Some performances never had encores. There are stories, whispered in corridors, scratched into forgotten scrolls of orgies that turned lethal. Where dozens gathered, masks on, rules off. Where no one left until someone stopped breathing, not by accident. By design. Because the ultimate climax wasn't pleasure. It was possession so complete it ended in ruin. Some emperors even filmed their desires in murals, rooms filled with mosaics of pain, not to condemn it, but to immortalize it. Rome loved its brutality the way it loved its wine, aged, expensive, intoxicating. And those who bled? They were part of the performance, never the director. Never the audience. Only ever the stage. Her name was Livia Drusilla, wife of Emperor Augustus, mother to Tiberius, and the most powerful woman in Rome. They called her virtuous, pious, the perfect Roman matron. But behind her downcast eyes and folded hands was a mind sharper than any blade. She understood the rules. She didn't fight them. She refined them. Livia used her position not for rebellion, but for calculation. Every gift she gave, every whisper she released, was part of a map no man could see. She was rumored to have arranged deaths, to have removed rivals, to have molded emperors from the cradle. Her battlefield wasn't the Senate floor. It was the bedroom, the nursery, the altar. Rome never saw her draw blood, but it bled anyway. Then there were the meretricious elite courtesans trained not only in sex, but in music, poetry, politics. They wore crimson to announce their status. They were not wives, but they could whisper into a senator's ear, sway decisions, even blackmail. Emperors. One, named Volumnius Cytheris, was lover to Mark Antony, a slave who rose so high, she rode through Rome in his chariot. She knew her body was a currency, but she set the exchange rate. She chose her clients, set her terms, and when necessary, used secrets as armor. Still, her power had limits. The moment she was too loud, too old, or too clever, society turned on her, because in Rome, a clever woman was a threat. And threats were not tolerated. Even the Vestal virgins, bound by vows of chastity, learned to leverage their sacred status. With access to inner temples, legal privileges, and unspoken influence. Some Vestals became political players, interceding in executions, manipulating rituals, even protecting accused criminals. They were feared and revered, but their power came with a price. If they were ever suspected of breaking their vow, even falsely, their punishment was unthinkable. Entombed alive with only a lamp and bread. Some historians whisper that rival families would plant rumors to eliminate powerful Vestals. That behind every stone wall lay not guilt, but strategy. So the women adapted. They played the game, not to win, but to survive longer than expected. Not all women in Rome were silent. Not all bowed. Some learned to speak the system's language. and then twist its tongue. But every weapon they wielded came with a cost. Power earned in shadows meant they could never walk freely in the light. They were admired, feared, destroyed, because in a world where women were supposed to suffer, those who refused became dangerous. The temple smells of jasmine, blood, and burning fat. Gold statues tower over kneeling bodies. Priests chant in rhythm. And in the inner chamber, the gods are said to listen, but they never speak, because this isn't prayer. It's performance.in. Ancient Rome, the line between worship and indulgence didn't exist. Many deities weren't just prayed to. They were pleased, fed, and sometimes serviced through acts of the flesh. The goddess Venus, divine mother of love, had temples where ritual sex was offered by temple women, and sometimes men, believed to be sacred vessels. These weren't marriages. They weren't choices. They were sacrifices of autonomy masked as holy duty. Worshippers lined up, coins exchanged, consent assumed. The gods were honored. The bodies were forgotten. Some didn't just serve the gods. They became living symbols of them. In the cult of Cybele, the Great Mother, young men were chosen to undergo a brutal ritual, self-castration, in a moment of divine ecstasy. They became Galli, sacred eunuchs, clothed in saffron robes, dancing in frenzied rites through Roman streets. They were revered in ritual and mocked in public, feared for their in-between identity, tolerated for their utility, but never seen as fully human again. These were men who had been unmade in body, in order to embody the divine. But did the gods protect them? No. When Roman law later turned on them, declaring their rites too obscene, too foreign, too wild, they were banished. The gods they bled for never answered. They had been used, then erased. Rome's rulers didn't need approval. They needed divine excuses. Emperor Elagabalus, high priest of a Syrian sun god, turned his palace into a temple brothel. Sacred chambers were lined with perfume and silk. Rituals blurred into orgies. Guests were invited to worship by watching or joining in the debasement of others. He claimed it was religious duty, that he was serving the gods through pleasure. But there was no salvation, only spectacle. Even the death of children could be hidden beneath the veil of sacrifice. In some fringe cults, it's rumored that youth were given to the gods, their bodies broken, their innocence framed as sacred offering. No one was punished, because the gods, it was believed, had already accepted the gift. Rome loved its gods, but it used them like it used everyone else, as justification, as armor, as theater. When a girl screamed in a temple, she was singing for the divine. When a boy bled beneath the altar, he was chosen. When a slave collapsed mid-ritual, it was said their soul had ascended. But in truth, the gods watched, the crowds cheered, and no one came to help. The feast is loud. Wine spills from golden cups. Laughter rings out. A senator shouts for more music, and the performers obey. One girl juggles. Another dances on bleeding feet. A boy with a bruised lip mimics a general's march, and the crowd erupts with joy. But no one hears what his body whispers, because he's smiling. In Rome, pain didn't end when the ritual stopped. For those who survived the empire's sexual machine, the expectation was performance. You did not flinch. You did not cry. You smiled or were punished. Slaves who had been violated became jesters. Girls who had been taken became favorites. Boys with shattered pasts became entertainers, expected to laugh, tease, arouse, all while hiding the truth that lived behind their eyes. To survive, they had to turn trauma into a costume. One story survives of a slave boy named Felix, whose name meant happy. He was a favorite at banquets, known for clever jokes and acrobatics. Men adored him. Women pitied him. Children clapped when he spun. But in one rare inscription, someone carved words that hinted a truth deeper than the stone. he smiled for us, but he never once laughed. Because Rome demanded not just your body, but your spirit. To admit hurt was weakness. To show anger was defiance. To fall apart was unacceptable. So they played roles. They became caricatures of cheer, not because they were healed, but because it was the only way to avoid being hurt again. The empire was not content to break you. It wanted you to thank it for doing so. The emotional afterlife of Rome's pleasure systems was invisible, but everywhere. No records detail the nightmares. No statues capture the tremble in the servant's hand, but it's there, in the quietest corners of Roman poetry. In the unnamed pet boys who vanish from scrolls. In the temple girl whose face was never painted, only used. Survivors had no memorials, no justice, no legacy. Only masks, smiling masks, dancing masks, masks that said, "I am fine," even when they weren't. Because in Rome, if you were broken, you smiled harder. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest rule of all. The sun strikes the marble of the Palatine Hill. Tourists pose between columns. Children chase pigeons in the shadow of fallen gods. A guide gestures to crumbling walls. This was the emperor's private quarters. That was the bathhouse. Over there, the Temple of Venus. Everyone nods, click, smile, move along. No one speaks of the silk-draped rooms buried beneath. Of the screams muffled by walls too thick to hear through. Of the blood that soaked into tiles now polished for photos. Because Rome, grand, eternal. Rome tells the stories it once remembered. Power, glory, empire. But the pain, the shame, the secrets? They were hidden in silk. And now they hide in stone. In museums, you'll find the statues. Smooth, cold, perfect. Venus with her head tilted coyly. Apollo, muscled and bare. Hermaphroditus, half man, half woman, draped in mystery. But who were the models? Whose bodies were used, posed, touched, immortalized without name? Were they slaves? Lovers? Prisoners of desire? We don't know. Because Rome didn't record the used. It remembered the users. And so the marble gods remain untouched by time, while the human beings behind them have been erased. But look closer. A scar etched beneath a robe. A posture too stiff to be serene. An expression that isn't ecstasy, but endurance. These are the quiet rebellions of memory. The ruins are quiet now. But once they pulse with moans and orders, prayers and screams. Pleasure and punishment. You've just walked through the darkest corridors of the Roman Empire. Not the ones chiseled in marble, but the ones written into flesh. Behind every silk curtain, beneath every banquet hall, behind every polished statue. There were people, children sold as objects, women who played gods to survive, men broken and smiling. Rome didn't just conquer land, it conquered bodies and called it tradition. And today, we walk those same halls with cameras. We marvel at the mosaics, never asking what was spilled between the tiles, because history remembers the power, but forgets the pain. That's why this story matters. Not because it's shocking, but because it's true. Not because it's ancient, but because systems like these never fully disappear. So if this story moved you, even unsettled you, don't let it fade in silence. Subscribe for more true stories that history tried to bury. Share this with someone who still believes Rome was all glory. And tell us in the comments, which part of this story will stay with you? The longest? Because sometimes the only way to honor the forgotten is to remember out loud.